Hello and welcome to episode number 22 of the Cheesesteaks and Controllers podcast, presented by Fox PHL The Gambler, 102.5 FM, 1480 AM, and iHeartRadio. I am Esports and Gaming Insider Jason Fanelli, and it has been a big week for video games. There are two brand new consoles now out in the wild. Congratulations to you if you were lucky enough to get one. My Xbox Series X will be here, I think Friday is what the plan is. A couple days late, but I guess I really can't complain. Some people are in worse spots than I am. PS5 I'm going to wait on begrudgingly, just because can't do both right now, but that's neither here nor there. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about some fighting games, because I love talking about fighting games. Specifically, we're going to talk about online fighting games and what the troubles they're having are right now, and a certain type of online format that may change the game, as per Tekken introducing it earlier this week. We'll get into that. We're going to talk about the best launch games ever for all the consoles that have come out previously, the best games launching with those consoles. And then finally, we're going to get into a little bit of a rant. I'm going to get a little angry at the end of this episode because this week has brought out some of the worst in society, and I just want to tell them how much they suck. But first, before any of that, let's start with the 6 in 60 seconds. The Philadelphia Fusion have parted ways with Ivy, Sato, and Fury from last year's team, but still have not signed anyone new other than Mono as of this recording. The Call of Duty League has made changes to two teams, where Optic Gaming LA becomes the LA Thieves, now owned by 100 Thieves, and the Chicago Huntsmen become Chicago Optic after their owner, H3CZ, bought the Optic brand. Also, Call of Duty player Maurice Ferro Henriquez dies at age 21 this week. He spent 2020 Call of Duty League with Florida Mutineers, and both the team and Call of Duty League made a statement mourning his death earlier this week. Elsewhere, the Halo TV series on Showtime taps Jen Taylor as the recast of Cortana, who is reprising the role that she played in all of the main Halo games previously. Xbox has announced that all Game Pass Ultimate subscribers can receive a free month of Disney Plus as one of its perks. And finally, All Elite Wrestling revealed 3 games in development under the AEW Games brand, 2 mobile games, and an unnamed wrestling console title made by the lead who worked on No Mercy on the Nintendo 64. Those were your 6 in a little over 60 seconds. Yes, folks, that is your 6 in 60 for the week. That news about Ferro, the Call of Duty player, is just heartbreaking. 21 years old, conflicting reports about how he actually passed away. There's this whole Twitter spat that happened after it that really makes you sick. You just wish that people could get over themselves and just let people mourn in peace, but I don't want to really get into that. Rest in peace, Ferro, and you will be missed in the Call of Duty scene from now on. But let's move on now to our first topic of the evening, and that is the future of online fighting games. Now, in this pandemic, esports and competitive gaming have really seen a surge, from NBA 2K League being on ESPN2 to the Overwatch League and Call of Duty League doing very well in viewership on YouTube, plus League of Legends on Twitch, all the other stalwarts. But what you're not seeing, or what you're not hearing about a whole lot, and I've said this many times before on this show, is fighting games, your Street Fighters, your Mortal Kombats, your Dragon Ball FighterZs, and others. Now, the tournaments are there. There are Mortal Kombat tournaments happening on the PlayStation YouTube channel. They do weekly invitationals, both on the European Union side and the US side. Street Fighter League is a thing where teams of 3 fight against each other in a big Street Fighter League, plus Capcom Cup is still in the works. Dragon Ball FighterZ is having a national championship with different countries around the world, so there are fighting game tournaments happening. However, fighting games online are notoriously atrocious. The games, what should be some of the most simple online format in the world, because rather than having 64 players in a Halo Big Team Battle match, or 8-on-8 in a normal shooter, or even Fortnite's 100 Battle Royale, fighting games are one player versus one player, and yet they struggle so much to make the format work, and I can't understand why they insist on doing it this way. So, the main reason for that, and I'm going to get a little technical here, but I hope you can follow along with me on this. So, the main type of netcode, or the coding language they put in so that so that games know how to speak to each other via the servers on the internet. The main one being used right now is something called delay-based netcode, and what that is so fighting game players measure moves by frames, and each frame is 1/60th of a second. So, 60 frames per second, you have one frame every 60 frames every second. You have one frame every 1/60th of a second. Yes, there it is. It is a mouthful, right? So, say you're playing a match with someone on the same TV. You both have your controllers in your hands. The games can process exactly what frames of that second you are putting your inputs in. So, if you press a punch button on frame number 4, it's going to know that you press the punch button on frame number 4, and then it's going to go through the punch attacks animations. The startup frames, where it's the animations of the character getting ready to punch. The active frames, where the character's fists are actually able to do damage to the other player. And then the recovery frames, where the animation goes back to the previous neutral stance. That is your basic fighting game lingo. Startup, active, and recovery. Delay-based netcode, the way that works is it actually delays the match so that inputs can be processed at the actual frames where they were processed. So, for example, say that you're fighting against somebody and the ping, or the time it takes for information to get from one player to the other, is 90 milliseconds, 90 frames worth of ping. You then have to wait about half of that, 45 milliseconds, or 45 frames, for an attack to register on the opponent's console after you press the button, which causes, and then as the game is waiting for this to happen, it just freezes. It doesn't do anything. So what you get a lot in these fighting games is stuttering. So, like, attacks that look like they're being chopped up as they're happening, or games that look like they're buffering a buffering YouTube video just without the little circle of death, things like that. It's very annoying, especially for a genre of games where precision and exact timing are key to success in the for anybody who's playing the fighting games. If you don't have that precise input, you're going to have a bad time playing these games. You're going to have a lot of people who know what they're doing and know how to get around the delays when they're not too bad, playing against them. So you need to then be able to work the delay, or work your timing, so that you know how long the delay is. But then again, if the game is stuttering and it looks like it's a buffering YouTube video, you're never going to get that experience down correctly. It's just not an efficient system. But unfortunately, it's one that developers of Japanese fighting games, your Street Fighters, your Tekkens, your Guilty Gears, and stuff like that, are insistent on using. There is a new option out there. It's been around since the mid-2000s, so it's not like it's brand new. Developed by a man named Tony Cannon, who now works for Riot Games working on their upcoming fighting game, Project L. He's also part of the Evo brass. I assume he is the head of Evo now, after the culling that went on back in July. He developed a type of netcode called rollback netcode. And what that means is the game never delays the action for any reason. Instead, what it does is if you press a button on frame number 2, if you both press a button on frame number 2, the game receives the input even after the delay, but will then basically simulate rewinding back to the frame where that input happened, and then playing out, again, a simulation almost of what should have happened if those inputs happened at the exact same time. That sounds virtually impossible and definitely should sound like something that is noticeable to the naked eye. But when you're dealing with 1/60th of a second or 3/60ths of a second, time that is so minuscule, you can simulate that in this rollback netcode without causing any issues to the frame rate of the game or the match itself. Now, there are instances where rollback gets very much accelerated on one side, so the player looks like he's jumping all around from animation to animation without actually doing anything. That match would be rendered moot. But in 99% of these instances, rollback has performed way better than any delay-based netcode system. And what brought this to the spotlight this week is that Tekken 7, one of the, if not the biggest fighting game franchises out there today, just released their Season 4 patch and content. Came out on Tuesday the 10th. It included a character and a stage as a second character and stage coming, other gameplay enhancements, and a completely redone online system featuring a rollback system. Well, the tweets to the creator, Katsuhiro Harada, on Twitter are some of the most glowing, respectful tweets you'll ever see from a gamer towards a creator, talking about how I'm currently in London and my friend is in California, but we were able to play online like we were sitting next to each other. All over the world, people are talking about how they connect to people in other countries and not have a single issue with connecting and playing as if they're playing right next to each other. This is massive. And the fact that it works in a game like Tekken 7, which, I mean, every fighting game has to do with that precision and timing I talked about earlier, but Tekken 7 takes that to the absolute extreme, where you're dissecting moves by the single frame on virtually every character in the game. If they're able to make this work, and players can play against each other in solid online arenas with solid netcode, where there's no stuttering, there's no hiccuping, there's nothing like that, and you're just playing the way you would play next to each other, this could be the turning point for fighting game esports. This is what the fighting game genre needs to kick itself into gear and become the esport that I think it is possible of being. Now, I've said this before, and I will say this again. Esports, the fighting games are the future of esports. The biggest esport in the world, in due time, will be a fighting game. I guarantee it. It's easier to follow to the casual player. It's less information that needs to be taken care of. Anybody can access it unless, of course, they are sensitive to flashing lights. Some of them have flashing lights, so you'd have to warn for that. But it's not like anything's in first person, so you don't have to worry about motion sickness. Anybody can access watching fighting games and jump right in without an issue. And if Tekken 7 can lead the charge to get the online where it needs to be, then the sky is the absolute limit for where fighting games can go in the future. But unfortunately, and when I talked to Maestro Haskins, when I talked to him a couple weeks ago about the paper he did in his anthropology course and other things about regarding fighting games, he spoke about how a lot of the reason that this rollback netcode isn't implemented in Japanese fighting games already, even though it's been out for so long, is because of pride. The Japanese studio heads recognize that this was not made by a Japanese studio, so they feel that they cannot support it, or they should not support it as much as the netcode they come up with themselves. That, of course, is silly. If your game performs better online with the rollback netcode, you should use the rollback netcode. It's that simple. But I'm hoping they come to their senses, and then by the time tournaments start to come back and we start getting back to the normal public living as we were before the COVID-19 pandemic, you could start to see robust online tournaments featuring players from all around the world that can culminate in these big Evo combo breaker final round events more fluidly, more logically. You could have, instead of having like 3,000 people for one tournament, you could play all those matches online, and then only the top 32 would need to play at the event. Now that's a temporary fix, or like an easing back into the tournament scene. Obviously, a lot of the fun of the tournament scene is being able to sign up and play on site. I'm not suggesting that we take that away forever. But as far as inching back into the scene after this pandemic, that to me would be a great way to do it. And rollback netcode is the key. Delay-based netcode does not work for fighting games the way it used to, if it ever did. Rollback GGPO is the answer. And if you're asking me, it's the only thing holding fighting games back from becoming the best esport in the entire world. It's all that the genre needs to get over that hump, to get over that, to climb that mountain and ascend to the ranks of top esports. But it won't happen without the solid netcode. It's as simple as that. It will not happen unless the fighting game developers put their pride aside, take this Tekken 7 patch as an example, and give us the online fighting game experience that we deserve, having been fans of these games for so very long. Some of us since we were little kids, before we could read, like me in Street Fighter. Give us the rollback netcode. Please stop with the hubris and allow your games to be enjoyed by as many people as possible in the way they are meant to be enjoyed, and the communities will only grow. So get on that, fighting game developers. We need you to We need you to do it now before this pandemic comes back. All right, enough about the rollback netcode. We talked a lot about that, but it's time to move on to what is coming out this week. And you're thinking to yourself, what else could possibly come out this week with the new consoles and everything else that has dropped? Believe it or not, there are 3 big titles that you should have an eye on coming out Friday and later next week. So fill up those glasses. It's time for What's on Tap. Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, a return to the Black Ops part of the Call of Duty franchise with Woods and Mason and all those characters, comes out on Friday the 13th, as does Kingdom Hearts Melody of Memory, a music-based return to through the entire series of Kingdom Hearts, using rhythm-based minigames to tell the stories that those previous games told. And then finally, Mortal Kombat 11 Ultimate, the next expansion of Mortal Kombat 11, adding Rain, Rambo, and Melina, drops on the 18th, which is Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. So look forward to that. If you already own the game on Xbox One or PlayStation 4, it will upgrade for free to Series X or PS5. Or on the console that you have it on, but you still will need to purchase the combat pack with Rain, Rambo, and Melina. So, you probably are filled to the brim with new console games to play, but there still are 3 things that are worthy of your attention. So what's on tap for you? Yes, that's right, that is what is on tap for this week. Among all of the console craziness, there is still Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War coming out this week. One of the biggest franchises ever in video games is just going to drop another series, or another version of the series, right on our laps, just as the new consoles come out. It is a crazy time to be a gamer, and it's impossible to keep up with all of this stuff. Speaking of the new consoles, a lot has been made of the launch lineups, the launch titles that are out with the consoles this time around, particularly on the PlayStation 5 side. You have Spider-Man Miles Morales and Demon's Souls as the big exclusives, and then you have Astro's Playroom, which is built in to every PS5 that is purchased. Every single one has this preloaded. However, this game seems to be really impressing people, really bringing out the best of what this console can do, while also being a walk down memory lane for everything that is PlayStation throughout the years. I saw a scene from someone who posted it on Twitter where they found an Easter egg for Tekken, which was a huge fighting game franchise on PlayStation. Even though it's a Bandai Namco franchise, they lent a little bit of their assets to this Astro's Playroom just so those players that play a lot of fighting games on PS1 like me would get a pop. That's awesome. That might be one of the games I'm most excited to play on the early PS5 is Astro's Playroom. Astro's Playroom may actually overtake Hexic HD as the greatest preloaded game for any console of all time. But what I'm going to talk about today are the launch lineups of some of your favorite video game consoles, and we're going to basically pick which one is the best one of all time, starting with the original Nintendo. Now, obviously, you hear Super Mario Brothers and you think that's an all-timer. There's no way anything is going to top this. But the amount of quality games that came with the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, outside of just Super Mario Brothers, is pretty amazing. You had all of their sports games, so baseball, soccer, tennis, ice hockey, and Wrecking Crew. You had Ice Climber. You had Mach Rider, which is a bit of a niche action game. Duck Hunt, which is a classic. Golf is one of my favorite sports games. I don't think I mentioned that before. Excite Bike is great. Hogan's Alley is a good little light gun game, as is Wild Gunman. Wrecking Crew is another one of those good retro games. There's a ton of really good games in that launch lineup for the NES. More so than, like I said, you would actually expect. You would think it was just Super Mario and Duck Hunt because they were eventually packed into the system. But there was a lot more to get into right there when that launched back in 1985 here in America. Similarly, the Game Boy, while this doesn't have as many games with it when it launched in August of 1989, two of the best games on the console came out day one, those being Super Mario Land and another excellent pack-in game, Tetris. Tetris on the Game Boy. I said that word, and you hear the song in your head right now. In fact, I'm probably already playing it for this Game Boy section, but you never know. But yes, Tetris on the Game Boy, an absolute classic. That was August of 1989. The same month was the launch of the Sega Genesis, and believe it or not, this shocks me, as I thought that this was not the case. Sonic the Hedgehog was not a launch title for the Sega Genesis. Sonic the Hedgehog came later. I always thought that it was. Turns out I am wrong. The Sega Genesis launch titles are Altered Beast, which has the classic Rise from Your Grave, and the guy turns into the wolf and does all the crazy punches. You have Space Harrier 2, Super Thunder Blade, and Thunder Force 2, which are great games, and Tommy the Sword of Baseball, which is an underrated baseball game, if you ask me, but the fact that it launched on the system makes a lot of sense. Because it is old. It has not aged very well as far as Sega Genesis games go. Now, unlike the NES, we're going back to Nintendo here. September 1991, the Super Nintendo, when it came out in that year, only launched with 3 games. One of them being one of the greatest games of all time, in my opinion, Super Mario World, which was packed into the system. Another excellent game included with the console. But you also had Pilot Wings, which not a lot of people have played. It's about flying and a precursor to Flight Simulator, but much, much more simulated. Simplified. That's not even a word. Simplified. And then F-Zero, which is a high-speed racing game that was immediately overshadowed by Super Mario Kart when that finally came out. So 3 decent games, one of them being one of the best games of all time, but the lack of other games kind of offsets that a little bit. Also very surprised that the Super Nintendo didn't have more games that launched with it, but still, when you have Super Mario World, I guess you want people playing that more than anything else. Moving ahead now to the May of 1995, the Sega Saturn. It's interesting to note here that while there are some good games in this list for the Sega Saturn, the fact that the system launched in May, which was a total surprise. So what happened here is Sony PlayStation was coming out in September of 1995, and Sega was planning on putting the Saturn right up against it. as a holiday showdown, not unlike what's happening this year with Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. However, at E3 that year, in May, because it was in May back in the day, Sega decided they were going to throw a curveball and release it that day. They shadow dropped the Sega Saturn after their E3 presentation in May and didn't tell anybody, including retailers and third-party publishers. They were the only ones that knew that the Sega Saturn was launching in May and not in September, which meant two things. One, people were scrambling to buy a console they couldn't find, which I guess is not unlike what's happening now, but we'll get into that. And only 6 games came out for the Sega Saturn on launch day, and they were all, or mostly all, first-party games. You had Daytona USA, which is a classic arcade racing game brought to the Saturn and translating pretty well without the wheel. You had Panzer Dragoon, which is a big cult hit and was just remade for the Switch and other consoles not too long ago. Another excellent packing game is Virtua Fighter. The original Virtua Fighter on Sega Saturn was arcade perfect and one of the best translations from arcade to home console ever made. And then Clockwork Knight, which is a bit of a niche game, one of those underrated gems for the console. It came out right when it launched. So that's a decent one. Again, very much hampered by the fact that they shadow dropped it without telling anybody. There are some very good games on Sega Saturn, but that immediately put a bad taste in people's mouths, and it kind of went from there with that console. So now we move on to the PlayStation, Sony PlayStation 1, the first one. The first PlayStation didn't really have a lot going on here. NBA Jam Tournament Edition was huge. Having the arcade perfect NBA Jam at home was really, really cool. You had 2 fighting games of varying quality. Battle Arena Toshinden, which was great at the time, but has not aged well. And then Street Fighter the movie, which I am not going to say any more about. Luckily, 2 months later, they had games like Tekken 1, Destruction Derby, and the first Twisted Metal following up. So that launch lineup was immediately buffered not too long after it launched. But still, those first 2 months were a bit bleak, unless you liked NBA Jam or Ridge Racer, which was their Sony's first-party racing game, racing franchise at the time. But just 1 year later from the Sony PlayStation, September 1996, we have the Nintendo 64. And you thought the 3 games that launched with the Super Nintendo was paltry? Nintendo 64 launched with 2. Ironically, 2 games from 2 franchises that also launched on the Super Nintendo. Obviously, the main game was Super Mario 64, which is iconic and introduced the idea of a platformer in a 3D world. Kind of hard to bring that one down as far as historical significance goes. But the other launch title was Pilot Wing 64, which was there. Very hard to defend nowadays. Not one of the greatest games on the Nintendo 64 by any means, but it was one of the first. And for that, we have to give it some credit, even though it basically just sat on the shelf while everybody played Super Mario 64 for a little while, right? We're going to move on now to 9/9/99, September 9th, 1999, with one of my favorite consoles of all time, and one that was way ahead of its time, and that is the Sega Dreamcast. Now, I still have my Sega Dreamcast around here somewhere, and it was my fighting game machine. I had Capcom vs. SNK 1 and the Japanese import of 2, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and other games. But the launch lineup was numerous. I'm looking at about 20 games here that launched on the Sega Dreamcast on 9/9/99. But unfortunately, not many of them are worth writing home about. You have the first NFL 2K, which, if you say NFL 2K to anyone now, they swoon and pine for the days of yore where NFL 2K was actually competition to Madden games of today. You had Hydro Thunder, which was a really good arcade racer. You had House of the Dead 2, which is one of the best arcade shooters ever made. Didn't really translate well to the controller, though. You needed one of the light guns in order to really make that work. Power Stone, which is an underrated little arena fighter by Capcom. Ready to Rumble Boxing, which was the over-the-top boxing Sort of like Punch-Out, but not quite, with the crazy characters like Afro Thunder, and I think Michael Jackson was in one of the first couple games. It might have been round 2, but he was in there. Sonic Adventure, which was Sonic's 3D platforming debut, which is a great game. But you also had one of the greatest fighting games to ever launch with a console in Soul Calibur 1. Soul Calibur 1 basically showed you that translating a game from the arcades to the consoles was more possible now than ever. Whereas the Saturn Virtua Fighter brought the arcade perfect Virtua Fighter to the Sega Saturn dutifully, this proved that not only could you do that, but you could enhance them and make them better. I was watching a video on launch fighting games earlier today, and the guy giving the talk, Maximilian, mentioned that the arcade version of Soul Calibur was actually running on souped-up PlayStation hardware, whereas this more powerful Dreamcast made the game look even more fluid and better than it was originally. And that really opened people's eyes to what the consoles could now do, and kind of sort of signaled the downfall of the arcades as we knew it. I mourn for those days, but now that I can play games like I can now at home on my consoles, it's kind of hard to justify, other than a nostalgia trip, current arcades the way they were back then staying around now. But rest in peace, Aladdin's Castle in the Granite Run Mall. You will be sorely missed. Moving on now to October of 2000, we are now looking at the PlayStation 2, what would become the highest selling console of all time, but that did not look that way when it launched. You had some decent games in there. Street Fighter EX3, Tekken Tag Tournament, another one of the best fighting games to launch on a console of all time. Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2, NHL 2001, the first Midnight Club Street Racing, Madden 01. There's some good games in here. The problem is they're buffered by really weird one-off games that never really saw the light of day after this. Orphan, Scion of Sorcery, Kessin, which was an old, feudal Japan, feudal China, sort of like a Dynasty Warriors sort of thing, but you also had Dynasty Warriors 2 that came out. However, you also had Time Splitters, which is one of the most underrated shooter franchises of all time. Time Splitters 2 is a masterpiece. You heard it here first. And the first one launched with the PS2. So you did have some groundwork there, but that first launch lineup did not really do anybody any favors. 29 games total launched with that console, and about 10 of them were worthy of that status. The rest of them were just kind of forgettable, one-off, see you later sorts of things. I want to go back to a handheld real quick. Game Boy Advance, June of 2001. Lots of good stuff to like here when it launched. Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Fire Pro Wrestling, Super Mario Advance, Namco Museum, which was a bunch of old Namco games in one place. That was really cool. Earthworm Jim, F-Zero, Maximum Velocity, one of the best F-Zero games there is. So that is definitely one we should consider in this list as well. The original Xbox now is where we are, November of 2001, and all I have to say here is Halo Combat Evolved. The original Halo. What else is there to say? Sure, Project Gotham became a series for a while, Project Gotham Racing. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is not something I should shake a stick at. Dead or Alive 3, another good launch fighting game. But Halo. That's it. Without Halo, the Xbox Series X might not exist. Halo catapulted them into being taken seriously with video games, and that's it. So without that, you don't have Microsoft and video games anymore. So for historical significance alone, the original Xbox has to be up there. The same month, the Nintendo GameCube came out. I didn't realize that was the same month. That's interesting. This was an interesting mix of first-party and third-party titles. But again, a lot of them don't really stand out now like they did then. Crazy Taxi, launching on the GameCube, was a great idea. Crazy Taxi is an awesome game and does translate pretty well to the controller from the racing wheel. Luigi's Mansion, which at the time when I would admit was a bit underappreciated by yours truly, but that franchise has now excelled to new heights, and it started here. Star Wars Rogue Leader, Rogue Squadron 2, one of the best Star Wars games ever made, launched with the system. Madden launched with the system. NHL Hits, which was the NFL Blitz, but for the NHL. Sequel to Wave Race, which is a franchise I wish would come back. Wave Race Blue Storm. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. And a couple of other games not really worth mentioning. GameCube had a solid lineup, but the thing with GameCube is, about a month later, Super Smash Bros. Melee came out, and that was it. There was no way that the GameCube wasn't going to be successful after that. Super Smash Bros. Melee catapulted that system into the stratosphere. It's still played today, even with 3 Smash Bros. Games having followed it. One of the most highly regarded fighting games of all time, and definitely deserves to be mentioned on our list here. Even though it wasn't technically a launch title, it came out a couple days later, if not a month later, but it's definitely one that needs to be thought of when we're talking about stuff like this. Meanwhile, the Nintendo DS, which launched in November 2004, the first dual-screen handheld from Nintendo, is not one that we really need to talk about as far as their launch title games, launch day games, because they had Super Mario 64, DS, and then nothing that I have heard of since it launched. Herbs, The Sims in the City, Spider-Man 2, which not very good on the DS. Let's just move on. Next chronologically is the PSP, the PlayStation Portable, in March of 2005. A couple of good fighting games like Darkstalkers Chronicle, The Chaos Tower. Also Twisted Metal Head-On was a new Twisted Metal game, which is never a bad thing. Metal Gear Acid, which was an interesting card-based Metal Gear game. But really nothing that pushed it over the top. Nothing really stuck out for the PSP in March of 2005. Later that year, though, is the Xbox 360 in November of 2005. And there are some bangers in this list, if you ask me. Condemned Criminal Origins is one that needs to be considered. Call of Duty 2. The sports games that year, NBA 2K6, I loved playing that on the 360 when it first launched. Tiger Woods that year was very good. Quake 4, we had a lot of fun with. So the Xbox 360, it's not the best launch window for sure. Not the best launch lineup. Definitely was lacking some first-party titles like your Halo and stuff like that. But Series X is too, and nobody's saying anything. So the 360 is definitely not one of the best, but one that a couple of games should be remembered. PS3 is sort of the same thing because it took so long for developers to figure out how to make the games for the PS3, a very notoriously difficult system to develop for. But you still got Call of Duty 3, you still got Marvel Ultimate Alliance, still got Need for Speed Carbon, you still got Resistance Fall of Man, which is an excellent first-person shooter on PS3. So some good games to consider when the PS3 launched. But that, I have to say, was immediately overshadowed, not 3 days later, by the Nintendo Wii. The Wii launching was insane. If we're going to talk about the best pack-in games or the best preloaded games of all time, Wii Sports has to be in that conversation because it took the world by absolute storm. And then you had Zelda Twilight Princess for your hardcore fans, Red Steel, which was an underrated first-person samurai shooter game, Marvel Ultimate Alliance again, as we talked about, Dragon Ball Z, Budokai Tenkaichi 2, which works surprisingly well on the Wii, Trauma Center, Second Opinion, which is an underrated series. Just a lot to like on the Wii. Top heavy, for sure. Wii Sports and Twilight Princess definitely leading the charge. But there are some games in that stack that you could find that were worthy of your attention as well. The next one on the list is not for 5 years. We went with the same consoles for 5 years until the Nintendo 3DS launched in March 2011. Not a whole lot to write home about with this launch lineup. You have Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition, Nintendo Dogs and Cats, and then that's about it. So let's just move on to the PlayStation Vita, which is sort of the same thing. Vita didn't have that game that really drew people in like the Wii did. Its launch games, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, was where I wanted to get into it. The fact that I could play Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 on the go was huge for me. But outside of that, like Plants vs. Zombies was on consoles. Rayman Origins was great, but it was on consoles. And I didn't really feel the need to take that with me wherever I went. So, not really worried, feeling the Vita's launch lineup right here. And then we get to the Wii U, which was November of 2012. And this is a surprisingly good launch lineup considering what happened to the console after that. So first, it had an Assassin's Creed game. Did you remember that Assassin's Creed 3 launched with the Wii U? I didn't. I didn't remember that at all, but here we are. It certainly did. Batman Arkham City did as well. 2 massive games that year. Call of Duty Black Ops 2, another one. Darksiders 2, another one. Just Dance 4, which Just Dance is now a huge franchise, but I'm still getting its feet under it. Mass Effect 3 was on the Wii. New Super Mario Bros. U was your first party game. Nintendo Land was the pack-in, which was alright. Not as good as Wii Sports, but fun to be had. Ninja Gaiden 3 was on the console. Tekken Tag Tournament 2 had its own Wii U edition with some extra Mario-themed things. Zombie U is an underrated zombie game. Really, a really good launch lineup for this console, which really makes the fact that it bombed all the more surprising. Now, granted, it was because of 2 main reasons. It wasn't supported by third parties, and then it also wasn't really buffered by Nintendo either. They created a big mess for themselves by naming it so close to the Wii that they created a lot of confusion as to what is what, and that threw some people off. So the Wii U launched well, but everything that came after that is what hurt it. Then we're going to move on to the PlayStation 4, PS4. Obviously, one of the best consoles ever, one of my favorite consoles. I'm sad to see it go when the PS5 finally comes, but right now we are looking at the PS4, and there are some decent games in this launch lineup as well. I remember when I got mine, I went with, what did I go with? I'm trying to think. Now, Dive Kick was one that I went with. I went with Injustice Gods Among Us because I love that game. I went with Madden NFL 25 because I had to see Madden on the PS4. Warframe was a great free-to-download game that was worth playing. Knack has now become a bit of a cult classic platformer with Knack 2 having been released. Now everyone's looking for Knack 3. Call of Duty Ghosts was a decent Call of Duty game and a good one to launch the console with. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, I played that on Xbox One, but still, it was a very, very good game, and it launched with the console. Just Dance is now in 2014. You had FIFA, you had DC Universe Online, so you had a full MMORPG experience right out of the box. Very, very good console launch here. And Resogun, which everybody should play at least once. It was a launch title back in 2013 for the PlayStation 4, but still one of the most underrated games on the console. Resogun, make sure you play it. And then the competition right next to it was the Xbox One. And while the Xbox One had a lot of the same games, as we mentioned, it had Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. It had Call of Duty Ghosts. They both had Battlefield 4. Xbox One had a couple of interesting exclusives to go along with it, too. Rise, Son of Rome impressed a lot at that E3 that year. Killer Instinct didn't launch well, but soon grew into a very formidable fighting game worthy of people's time, so that's a good game too. Dead Rising 3, I blew through that game. That game was so good. I love Dead Rising, but Dead Rising 3 I think is a very good entry into that franchise. You had some duds, like your Fighter Within, the one game that used the built-in Kinect that went by the wayside really, really fast. Zoo Tycoon used it too, and that's a decent game, but the Kinect part of it really didn't fly all that well. So there's a decent amount of games here in this launch lineup for the Xbox One. The problem with it is the way it was marketed leading up to the launch that turned a lot of people off. They were wrecked at E3 that year. The fact that you couldn't, the rumors that you couldn't use games, and people would have to, once they put a disc in there, it would just be downloaded. You wouldn't be able to trade games in anymore or play or buy used games anymore. It was just a whole to-do, and it was their own dang fault. And to be honest, I am glad that the people who are in charge of Xbox now are who they are. Phil Spencer and the gang have really turned that name around, because back then all they were doing was getting egg on their face and making Xbox look bad. They're definitely in a better spot now than they were back then. So the next console, before we get to the brand new consoles, was the Nintendo Switch, which launched in 2017. The only thing I really have to say here is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild There were some other ones, Super Bomberman R, Just Dance, 1-2 Switch, which is a good way to learn how the controllers worked. But come on. This was the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild console. That's why you bought it on day one, and you didn't regret a second of it. I'm still playing that game now every once in a while, and it's pushing 4 years old, having come out on March 3rd, 2017. So that, my friends, it's still one of the best games on the system now. And like I said, it came out 4 years ago. And there's a sequel coming, so we're already in the midst of getting ready to play more of that excellent game. So now we come to the current consoles. Everything that's coming out on launch day for the Xbox Series X. We'll start with that since that came out on Tuesday. Obviously, the big titles are Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Bright Memory, which is an exclusive, Devil May Cry Special Edition, Destiny 2 Beyond Light, which is also available on Xbox One, Forza 4, Gears 5, Gears Tactics, Grounded, Fortnite is back on the console, Mortal Kombat 11 Ultimate is technically out this week, not quite a launch title, Ori Will of the Wisps moved up, Sea of Thieves moved up, Tetris Effect Connected moved up, Star Wars Squadrons moved up, Watch Dogs Legion, Yakuza Like a Dragon, which is catching a lot of people by surprise. Just a very great slate of games that, if you already owned on the Xbox One, moved up to the Series X. No questions asked. Plus, it also has Game Pass, which now has EA Play. We talked about that extensively a couple weeks ago. So we know what's coming out for the Series X at launch. Finally, the PlayStation 5 launch games. We have Spider-Man Miles Morales. We have Demon's Souls. We have Sackboy: A Big Adventure. We have the built-in Astro's Playroom, as I spoke about at the top of this section. And then you had your Bug Snacks, which is the best. Everyone should play Bug Snacks, but I'm getting off on a rant here. You have Godfall, which is a PlayStation exclusive. You had, again, Devil May Cry and Destiny and Assassin's Creed and Borderlands are on this console as well. Planet Coaster. The Pathless, which is another interesting game for PS5 only. Kind of plays like Breath of the Wild. But so that rounds out there, plus your sports games and stuff like that. So if we're going to take a look at the best launch lineup in video game history, if you're asking me, sitting here right now, it may be the Super Nintendo or the Nintendo 64. And the reason I say that is because, yes, they only launched 3 games in the SNES's case, or 2 games in the Nintendo 64 case, but they are the perfect examples of quality over quantity. You had Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo and Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64, which were 2 of the most iconic games ever made, revolutionized the 2D platformer, introduced the 3D platformer, and really set the stage for worlds of gaming from here on out. So if you're asking me what the best launch lineups of all time are, I'm going with Super Nintendo or Nintendo 64. It's a bit of a tie. I think I would push Super Nintendo just a little bit over because it did have F-Zero, which was the 3rd game of its launch lineup. And F-Zero was a very fun game to play. So I hope you enjoyed that trip down memory lane to celebrate the launch of the new consoles this week. Lots of launch titles to be had by many players. Let me know what you're playing at Big Man Fanelli on Twitter. Would love to hear about it. And hopefully you are having a lot of fun with whichever of the new consoles is currently sitting in your house right now. But it is now time to talk about something that really got under my skin this week in the speed run. So let's have it. So, as I've mentioned a couple times, obviously the whole last segment had to do with the launch of these new consoles. That meant that people were privy to retailer mishaps and other such things. Now, the retailer mishaps, I don't really blame on them. It's a pandemic. This is how they sought after items. If the system crashes, it crashes. It's just what happens. I understand those foibles. What I don't like is the lack of contingency for resellers. It is apparent to me that the reason that these retailers were so bogged down on their websites when these items came out is because the reseller bots, or the bots that resellers program to buy these things automatically for them, just sicked on every store that opened up stock on both the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5. And you may be saying, now I have no way to prove that that's what's going on here, but if I take one look at Amazon or eBay right now, in fact I will, as I'm sitting here on Thursday night, the PlayStation launched earlier today, the Xbox launched 2 days ago. Let's take a look at the Xbox Series X on eBay, shall we? And see what that number is. $14.99 is the first thing I see. $1,500 for a $500 console. And the picture is a stack of 5 of them. So this particular guy, bought 5 consoles, and he's selling probably all 5, potentially 4 of them, at $1,500 a pop. He's trying to make $1,000 a console. That is absurd. $675, $1249, $1050, $805, $1098. The list goes on. And that's just Xbox. Let's check PS5, shall we? Let's take a look and see what those numbers are. $18.99, $19.50 in a picture with 5 of them. $16.99, $13.99 for the digital edition. $1,200, $11.50, $15.25. I could keep going. What is this? How are these people allowed to do this? Why isn't there some sort of contingency that allows people who want the systems to buy them at the number they should be buying them at? It makes no sense to me. I do not understand how these people are allowed to get away with this. And I also, unfortunately, don't know where the solution is to have them mitigated. Is it the retailers trying to figure out a way to limit resellers? Now, I know that this isn't a brand new thing with these consoles. I understand people who regularly try to get Nike sneakers on the sneaker app are probably laughing at me right now because they deal with this, once a week? Once every couple weeks? So, that I understand. I'm not surprised. But again, going back to my question, who mitigates this? Is it the retailers trying to find a way to sniff out the bots and make them disconnect so that the real people can get through? How do you do that? Is it the product owner? Is it the product makers' issue? Should Xbox and PlayStation have some sort of thing in place so that resellers can't get to their consoles? They did on their own websites. PlayStation Direct specifically had a queue system where you signed on, it put you in a digital queue, and then when it was your time, you went in, and if you could get one, great. If you couldn't, you couldn't. Is it the government? Does the government have to step in and say, hey, reseller bots are illegal. If we catch you using them, you get fined. But then how do you track that? I mean, obviously, they probably have technology that I wouldn't even consider. But who mitigates this? Because this is extortion. It should not be legal. This is extortion of the highest order. These pictures on eBay of people with stacks of... This picture is 5 PlayStation 5s in one picture. And he's selling each one for $19.50. A $500 console for $2,000 after shipping. That to me is just the lowest of the low dirt bastard. I think that's a word I can get away with saying. I'll make sure. I'll edit it if I have to. Just the worst people on earth. I don't know how they I just don't know. I don't know how these people are able to do this. I don't understand why there aren't any contingencies in place. It hurts me. I have friends in my main text message group. I have friends who were on Walmart's website. Walmart on Thursday, on the actual launch day, had stock released at noon, 3, 6, and 9 p.m. 4 different times they had stock released. And 2 of my poor friends were unable to get one at all. Noon, sold out in 5 minutes. 3 was sooner than that. From first-hand experience, so I pre-ordered the Series X and I pre-ordered the PlayStation 5 successfully. It turned out I was only getting one, as I mentioned earlier, so I gave my friend my PS5 pre-order, and I stuck with the Series X. My Series X was delayed a couple days. I was mad at the time. I'm not mad now. Obviously, the light is at the end of the tunnel. I can rest easy. His PS5, the one that I gave to my friend, came on time. It got here about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He picked it up. He's happy. Good. But I tried when Amazon delayed the Series X. I tried on Tuesday to get a Series X and for in-store pickup at Best Buy and at Walmart. Best Buy's site basically crashed when their stock went up. Walmart said that they were releasing stock at noon, and it was sold out by 12:01. Now, you mean to tell me that there were enough people on that website that were able to, A, connect to the server, get through all the processes without any of the pages dropping, and buy the console in a minute? There were that many people? No, I don't buy it. There were bots. And the people who made those bots are now extorting people on eBay and Amazon Marketplace with these insane markups and somehow getting away with it. It needs to stop. I don't know how. I would love to have a solid idea. I don't, just because I don't know. I don't know how the bots work. I don't know how to program them. I wish I did. I'm at a loss for words there. But the fact that this is happening is just brutal. There's a kid who's going to want one of these consoles for Christmas. And his parents are either going to have to shell out a damn mortgage payment to get him one, or her one, or tell their kid no, because they couldn't get one at the price they could afford, the retail price, the intended retail price. Yet there's a stack of 5 PS5s staring at me on eBay for damn near $2,000 each. Makes me sick. And if you're listening to this right now and you're one of those people, there's a special place in the afterlife for you. No matter what religion you are, who you believe in. And your time will come. Whether it's people finally figuring out how to make these illegal, or judgment is saved till after you move on from this life. I don't know. I hope it's the former. I assume it's the latter. But whatever it is, it makes me sad that you do this. And I hope it's worth it. I really do. I hope it's worth it for you. And I also hope that nobody buys them at these insane markups and you're stuck with them. You're out $2,000 or $2,500, whatever. If you're not planning on playing any of them, you're out $2,500. If you're forced to sell them at what you bought them for. If you're keeping one, then fine, keep that one. But the other 4, it just makes me sick. I'm sorry. That was a bit of a rant. I know. I think I was getting yelled at for being too loud on a Thursday night, which is new. That's a first for me. I'm usually pretty loud, but I guess tonight I could be heard, so sorry about that. But one more thing before we adjourn for the week. This is a happy thing. I am proud to report that my Extra Life charity campaign went off this weekend without a hitch. I played video games all day Saturday, and I raised $1,565 for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Thank you to all of my donors. You can still donate at www.extra-life.org/participant/Jason-Fanelli. You can donate till the end of the year, and it will count towards this year's tally. $1,565 raised for CHOP, still moving strong. So if you feel the need to do that, please look at my previous episodes. The URL is right in the info, and you can donate right there. And with that, we are at the end of episode 22 of the Cheesesteaks and Controllers podcast. We talked about the future, we talked about the present, we talked about the past. It was a heck of a show, and I'm glad you stuck with me until the end. So until next week, I am Esports and Gaming Insider Jason Fanelli for Fox PHL The Gambler, 102.5 FM, 1480 AM, and iHeartRadio in Philadelphia. Next up on Saturday is Liberty Line Radio, bringing you the best in sports before tomorrow's Eagles game. Look for Sunday service, 9 a.m., starting at 9 a.m. On Sunday, leading you into the Eagles game on Sunday. Stay safe out there. Stay healthy. I hope you all have a great week, and I will talk to you next week for episode number 23.